Welcome to this video series on supply, demand and tariffs. Part 1. Demand influence. Influencing demand to meet supply. Looking first at electricity demand, we have to find the Goldilocks point. Not too much, not too little, but just right. But first, a quick recap. Power is energy divided by time, and it's measured in watts or volt-amps. We can rearrange that equation to get energy. Energy is power times time, and we normally measure it in watt-hours. But you only really need to remember that meters measure energy. So what about demand and supply? What are we referring to with the word demand? Well, the word demand is used because of its economic and physical relationships to supply. But again, we only need to remember that both supply and demand refer to power, not energy, to power. Demand is the power required by consumers, and supply is the power that must be generated and delivered to meet the demand. A utility must try to ensure that they have enough power to always meet the changing demand of its consumers. A quick word on real and apparent power. The useful power used by consumers, that's real power, is not quite the same as that generated by the utility, which is apparent power, due to the inefficiency of transmission, reactive power losses. Now, by convention, real power is measured in watts and apparent power in volt-amps. For the purpose of supply and demand, we are referring to real power in watts. However, a tariff demand charge may be levied by the utility based on apparent power in volt-amps. We often refer to an electricity demand curve. The demand requirements of consumers can be plotted against time on a graph. That's a demand curve, and it shows the power, shown in watts, required at a given time. Looking at typical electricity demand, the demand for electricity roughly mirrors the activities of the population. So during the night and weekends, off-peak demand is the norm. It's still significant though, because many industries have 24-hour operations. Peak demand is usually in the late afternoon evening, when the combination of industrial activity and meal preparation for consumers occurs. It's important to realize that consumers don't attach the same level of necessity to all demand, as shown on the left. Some of the demand is time critical, some is time flexible, some is discretionary completely, and some is actually unnecessary. This allows the utility to influence consumer behavior, to change what power they use and when they use it. The daily demand curve, which looks a little bit like a double camel hump, varies across the week, with weekends and public holidays requiring less demand. It varies across the month, but is nonetheless fairly repeatable, and it varies across the year, generally with more demand being required in one season than another. So if demand has a curve, so must supply. A supply or merit order curve is somewhat different though, because it shows the generation capacity versus the cost to produce it and or the price it's sold for. A given amount of power sells or costs a corresponding amount of money. Utilities have different means to produce electricity, some more expensive than others, so cheaper forms are always used first. That's why it's called a merit order curve. The cheapest is coal and nuclear, and the most expensive is electricity produced from gas and oil. As we'll see, it's more useful if we redraw the supply graph so that the supply capacity is on the y-axis on the right. This involves tipping over our previous graph to the left by 90 degrees as shown. So now we have the supply capacity on the y-axis and the production cost on the x-axis. It's particularly interesting to have a look at the effects of new low-cost production, particularly renewables where the cost of the fuel is zero, that's sunlight and wind, pushes the supply curve up and to the right, and lowers the average cost of production. We don't need Inspector Clouseau to tell us that managing supply and demand is difficult.
I know when there is a trouble and when there is not a trouble, and I can definitely tell you that there is a trouble, you may rest assured of that.
When supply is constrained due to constant heavy demand, the effective maintenance becomes difficult, and operational failures can result in removed supply. This increases the average production cost and possibly incurs periods of load shedding when supply cannot meet demand. Demand and supply are like mirror images of one another, so we can put them next to each other, with the demand curve on the right and our modified supply curve on the left. We can link these two conveniently together so that the demand corresponds with supply. Using the two graphs can tell us when that demand will occur on the right axis and what will be the cost of production and/or price received on the left axis. The combination of the two graphs allows us to have a look at the concept of load shedding and demand clipping. When supply is so constrained during the peak periods, it may be necessary to perform load shedding, which effectively clips demand, but it's also costly to the utility in terms of higher costs and lost revenue, as well as harmful to the economy in general. And load shedding is no joke.
Is there anybody hiding there in the dark?
Let's take a look now at water demand. As Jack and Jill found out, water is most appreciated when it's not there. First, let's familiarize ourselves with flow and volume. Volume is measured in cubic meters, which is the same as kiloliters, whereas flow is volume divided by time. And depending upon the timescales, which are quite long for water in respect of electricity, it can be in liters per second, but more likely kiloliters per hour or kiloliters per day. Now, meters can measure pressure and flow, but for our purposes, we just need to remember that meters measure volume. And what are we referring to with the word water demand? Well, we only need to remember that both supply and demand refer to flow. Demand is the flow required by consumers, and supply is the flow that must be delivered to meet that demand. Water demand occurs over longer time periods than electricity, and it's very seasonal. Depending upon the particular climate of an area, off-peak demand could occur during the rainy season, and peak demand could occur during the sunny, dry season. We can also influence water demand just like we can electricity. We can decrease the peak demand through higher tariffs, water restrictions and surcharges, that's penalties, in the dry season, and we can encourage things like self-storage in the rainy season with higher seasonal thresholds and subsidies, that's during periods of off-peak demand. Without proper measurement and control, things can get quite out of hand.
This is a very serious matter, and everyone in this room is under the suspicions.
Well,
What? What was that?
The demand for water can be influenced by the supply utility. As I've said, consumer requirements vary considerably with the season. Consumers with running water often take it for granted, a problem often exacerbated by its low cost. Consequently, there's a high degree of waste and unnecessary demand. It's also more difficult and costly to determine and prevent technical losses, which tend to happen during times of stress. The utility influences consumer behavior to change what water they use and when they use it. So once again, looking at our conveniently linked demand and supply curves, this can be represented. Now, with respect to water, normally this is stored in dams, but it is possible to find alternative, generally more expensive sources of water from aquifers and desalination. The result is that the supply curve is normally quite inflexible. Using the two graphs, we can tell when that demand will occur, that's on the right axis, and what will be the cost of production and/or price received from the left axis. In the next part of this video series, Tailor-Made Tariffs, we'll look at an easy way to understand and build those tariffs to match the desired supply and demand.